I'll pass that along to Jay. Is there anywhere else that you can go to a restaurant that has a tree literally growing through the middle of it than Portland? I mean, have you guys eaten in Jay's Hut? Highly recommended. Well, we are going to have, we're talking like, oof, I didn't even think through the timing of this, but like 90-second to 2 minutes tops per person. Set a timer if you need to. But the first question that Brandy and Janelle, which I'll introduce them right after this, are going to be talking about is, how has your experience / story, tradition, and or the Spirit shaped your views on human sexuality? I know, now that I say it out loud, that's ridiculous. You know what? Like, let's not even try and say we did. We're just going to get into it, and because we really want to hear from Brandy and Janelle, and to model and also just engage, like, what the possibilities are when we have good faith dialogue with each other rather than trying to change each other. Janelle, I will introduce first because I've known her the longest between the two. Yeah. Brandy's very new to me. But Janelle and I went to Bible college together. I took, fun fact, took Janelle to her first anime and maybe last anime movie ever. Spirited Away, Miyazaki. Yeah, absolutely. And it was super fun. I had fun. I don't know if Janelle had fun, but we've been friends for a long time. We worked together as young staff pastors at a church in Oak Harbor, Washington, and have continued to be good friends over 20 years now. And so Janelle is coming and has the wonderful privilege of representing the more traditional side of the theological spectrum. And I was thinking about, like, some people gave some feedback from the last Building Bridges we did with the partisan panel that we had, where we had a, MAGA Christian nationalist. And some of the feedback was like, well, he wasn't a very good representation of that because he was so kind. I just thought it was kind of funny. Like, well, that's also why I had him. And also, yeah, that's true of him. That can be true of somebody who holds a different view than you do. There's the Brené Brown quote, people are hard to hate up close. And so obviously I'm picking people who are capable of good faith dialogues to model this for us, to model the possibilities. And so Janelle is someone who I've known for a long time. I love her. I love her character. I love her passion. I love everything about her. And I chose her to represent the traditional side because she is also someone who is committed to the long road with everybody she encounters. That's not like that she holds a traditional conviction. This is like the thing we do in Building Bridges, discovering common ground through conversation without compromising conviction. Like, community is possible in the midst of deep disagreement. And in fact, like, I would say that's probably where true community exists. There has to be difference. There has to be distinction. Otherwise, it's, what are we doing? Like, so she's not going to be a very good traditionalist in people's minds because she's filled with grace and love and sees the dignity of the other person always first above all else. That's why I would have her do this. So here's what's possible. You can hold this position, and this is something I think Portland needs to hear. You can hold this position and be the most loving, grace-filled, putting self-centered, the way you just rattle those off, other-centered, co-suffering, self-sacrificial, loving person. She does that. Brandy is brand new to me, and so I have no idea. But She came highly recommended by Brenda Salter McNeil, who's someone that I really look up to, that has been a pioneer in racial reconciliation in the church. She gave the greatest message I've ever heard at a Foursquare convention, and she said, I can't do it, but here's somebody who can. And so I went and listened to Brandy's podcast, Reclaiming My Theology, listened to a conversation with Willie Jennings, I think is the one I went to first, because I love Willie Jennings, and listened to Brandy and listened to her heart and was just blown away by how she carries herself and how she communicates. And then I had the opportunity to talk to her, and she told me all about how her church had just left her denomination and the role she played in that. And thought I need to get to know her a little bit because I don't know what's happening. And one of the things that's really stuck with me, and I'm sure you'll talk about this tonight in this, specifically this conversation, when it comes to discovering common ground and seeking to be a community that does foster a multitude of beliefs, is who holds the burden of disagreement. And that's something that has really sunk into my heart, that I'm sitting with. And so I'm so excited to hear more about that, and then getting to introduce these two via Zoom and just see their connection. I'm excited that we get to watch that connection unfold further as they jump into this first question. So why don't we bring them up? Janelle and Brandy, let's give it up. And the first question is, and I will give, we got to keep them kind of close, because how far out can we go, Jeremy? We're good right here? Okay. And this is what I was going to ask you at your tables and realized that was ill-advised. Yeah, I already read it. How has your experience, story, tradition, the Spirit shaped your view on human sexuality? So you guys get to share your story of what brought you to the place that you are in October of 2024, which may or may not be the place you are in November of 2025. Who knows, right? But tell us how you've arrived at to do the work of the accuser and create categories. We have a traditional person and an affirming person. And how have you arrived at that position? And you guys can pick who goes first. All right. She pointed at you.
So to know me and where I came from is to know that I didn't grow up in the church, and insofar as I did, I came in like middle school to a very conservative evangelical Baptist church in Forest Grove. And it meant that I was given a Bible and an apologetics book at the same time. Like I was given The Kingdom of the Cults, if any of y'all are like OG enough to know that one, and a Bible. And I came from a pretty unstable background, and so having systematic theology was like water to my soul. It was stability that I didn't have in my family context, and it saved me in a lot of ways. I was just talking to Bethany at our table about how the church, because her parents went to the same church I did, which I did not know, and that church taught me to love the Bible. I think I had to deconstruct and unlearn a lot of what that church taught me, but that is one thing I have never lost, is a deep love for the Bible. And so I grew up with a highly traditional view of marriage and family that was highly connected to politics. So as we're in this moment, I hear a lot of the ringings of what I grew up with, which is that the family unit is how God saves the world, that the nuclear family unit is how God saves the world. And so marriage and human sexuality are of the utmost importance because God wants to create families to reflect God's love for the church. And you know, if the church is Jesus' bride, then we need to be really good on marriage and heterosexual marriage alone. And so I carried that position for a decade until I started working in full-time campus ministry. I worked with, my first position was at Reed College and at Lewis and Clark College. And so yeah, it was like #1 and #2 most godless schools in the nation by Princeton Review were my first assignments as like a young missionary kid. And so I was working with like all gay folks. Like it was just like everybody was queer. They thought they were queer. They might be queer. And I was like, oh my gosh. And what really happened is those students started asking questions that I thought had obvious answers, that when I tried to speak out of the obvious answers I had, started to sound pretty foolish. And so my students' questions and their life experiences forced me to look back on my own traditional perspectives and say, does the Bible really say that? Or does the Bible say that clearly? Or does the Bible say that with that much vitriol? Can this be said differently? And so my students' life experiences pushed me to have to engage with my own organization, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which notoriously in 2016 essentially made all of its affirming and queer staff fire themselves around that conviction. And so I found myself in a position where I wasn't totally sure about what I believed, but I knew that that kind of severing of community wasn't the fruit of the Spirit. It wasn't where the Spirit was leading me. And so I started doing the theological work I needed to do to be able to ask, how do I engage with my organization with integrity? And I landed in an affirming space. I then joined a church in Seattle, Quest, where we've recently had this break with our denomination around this. And so I think it became important because I thought it was an issue of national security, life, death, and hell growing up, but realized it was an issue of my students' lives. I watched my queer students be incredibly faithful and had to ask, like, what is it about their spirituality and my lack of answers that forces me back into myself? And so I think in coming to an affirming space, it's not because I was like, oh, this seems fun. It was because, oh, sorry, one thing to context, I'm queer. I just got engaged like on Tuesday to a woman. So like, I need you to know that like, this is not just like a theological position. This is my life too now. And working with my students in those contexts gave me permission to explore parts of myself with Jesus that I didn't know. And so it's not just an abstracted part of my existence. It's like a real part of my life. So.
Thanks for sharing, Brandy. It's a beautiful story. I'm Janelle, and I grew up with a single mom, raised by my grandmother, my Puerto Rican grandmother, my Mexican mom. But of course, in my grandmother's household, I am 100% Puerto Rican. And I think the number one goal above marriage and family was education. And so but we were focused on the family as evangelical, conservative, Republican as you can, one issue household. And I found myself in a Foursquare church, but I didn't know it was Foursquare church. And I just remember sitting in the back of the car with my best friend, and she went to a congregational church. And I thought every church was like my church until her mom said, oh no, she's a charismatic. And she believes in speaking in tongues, and we don't. And I was like, wait, what? But in that space, purity was the it, like, saving yourself for marriage. I had the ring, I had the necklace, I had, true love waits. And this was the lens through which I saw my formation. And if, and a lot of, like what Paul said, if I did these things, this equals I am good with God, like we're good. And then that turns into, then bad things shouldn't happen to me because I'm doing all the good stuff. And then I graduated from undergrad, went to Oak Harbor, Washington as a children's pastor, and I loved the rural Oak Harbor way of life, God and country. I mean, we served our soldiers. Yeah, right? And then one day, my boss comes barreling into my office, and he's like, Janelle, he's like, is this what you're going to do for the rest of your life? And then he goes, what do the next 4 years look like? And all of a sudden, I was like, what? He's like, when was the last time you asked God, am I supposed to be, like, what's next? And so he ruined my life. And I really felt the Lord call me to church plant on a college campus. So here I go with a handful, well, not, like 2 college students to LA. There was 3 of us. And we go to Westwood, to UCLA. And I was a USC fan up until that point. But I remember walking down Santa Monica Boulevard, and I remember walking through the gayest part of Los Angeles. And my heart broke into a million pieces. And I was like, Lord, what is this feeling? And the Lord's like, hey, I want you to go work at Starbucks. So I got a job at Starbucks. And the first week, and I got this job in 24 hours. And the first week, and I had these, like, we're going to plant a church. We already had the church. It's in Beverly Hills. Like, it's right by the campus. We're going to start meeting with a bunch of college students, like, at this night, and it's going to look like this. And I met Alfredo. And Alfredo goes, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Alfredo, I'm a church planter. I'm a pastor." And he's like, "Okay." He goes to the back, and he comes out, he's like, and by the way, this is my boss, who's like 21 years old. At the time, I'm like 34 years old. And he comes back, and he's like, "Miss," now he calls me Miss. I'm like, oh no. He's like, "Can I ask you another question?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "What's a pastor?" My life completely changed. And at that moment, the Holy Spirit said, "This is your church." And Alfredo changed my life that night. And for the next 4 years, we opened the Bible with our Starbucks coworkers, and we listened to the voice of Jesus, and we wrote in our journals, and I said, "What is God speaking to you?" And the first person to get baptized was Johnny, and he wore more makeup than I did. And he came to Malibu Beach with his studded Speedo, ready to give his life to Jesus. And in the midst of all that, I'm like, "Lord, I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand why me." I'm like, I wear cardigans. I don't have a tattoo on my body. I just came from one of the most conservative pockets of the West Coast. I don't believe in the things in the table that you're building. Why me? And the Lord's like, "That's exactly why you." And in that process, the Lord began to do an amazing work. It was revival. And we would have family dinners. They would come and bring their friends, and neighbors, and we would have 40 to 50 young people in our house. And then the Lord called me to Harvard University. And I remember the first month at Harvard, there was an evangelical speaker that came and gave an altar call and some very harsh words towards the LGBTQ community. And I remember me and a group of pastors were heartbroken. And the next day they asked us to sign a letter supporting and affirming LGBTQ, and I couldn't do it. But at the same time, the Lord's like, "You need to show up in this space." So there was a vigil, we showed up. And so this has kind of been my journey, is sitting in between these two tensions, and asking the Lord, like, "Okay, Jesus, I'm following your voice, I'm following your invitation, but I feel very ill-equipped to do so. Will you help me?" And every step of the way, the Lord's grace and love has opened doors and opened stories that would make you weep, that has made me weep, and has really, and I believe that, and I really believe that that is going to be an epicenter of revival, and it is currently. Although I do believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so in some aspects, I feel like, and I was just telling Rick this at our table, that I might be considered, and I talked to Andy about this earlier, I might be considered the most dangerous Christian in some spaces. Because in a lot of ways, I make room for these stories, but then, like, what is she gonna do with it? Is she gonna turn it and say, "Okay, accept," or "but," or "this is where we stop"? And so that is where I come today, and I don't really know if I have an answer for that, but thus far I've seen the faithfulness of God in that arc, and I wouldn't change any of it.
What do you guys each other's stories. And now just ask a follow-up question about something you want to know more about the issue.
That's a really good question. Can you give us like one more and then have us ask one so we have a little more context for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Does that sound good to you? Or do you have something right away?
No, go, yeah. Oh, wait, say that one more time.
Yeah, just a curious question about, and we'll do that one third, because it wasn't in the outline. We'll go straight to the next outline. And we got some of this, but maybe go some more into this, because Brandy, you found yourself at a church that this became such a significant issue that you had to break up with the denomination that you're a part of. And you were one of the people who helped lead as the chief storyteller at Blessed Church. And then Janelle, you've carried this burden in a conservative space and tried and navigated this. So the question is, like, how did this issue become to that level? You guys both carry this issue in a big way. How did it reach that level for you?
I mean, I think it's a little bit hard to be in the positions that we're both in, and we're going to hit the complexities of both of them. But for me, it was that I was watching queer students in my communities take their own life by suicide. It was that the fruit of the theology and the practices that I had seen in the church was literally death. And so I had to ask, if Jesus says, like, you know a tree by its fruit, then the fruit that I was seeing, whether of theology or practice or the intersection of them, because they're never fully aligned, and I think we have to be honest about that, was that my students were dying or considering taking their own lives. And that as I watched that happen, I had to ask Jesus, is this your will? Because I was hearing like really conservative pastors saying that it was the wrath of God coming over these folks, or like that it was punishment, like divine punishment somehow. And I was like, this is not a neutral thing. Like, I can't just sit and watch this happen and then not ask deep theological questions about the love of God and how the love of God wants to reach folks. And so I started going, because for me, I'm always going back to the Bible over and over again, and I just asked, how can I read, or how might I be invited to read differently? And for me, like a lot of how I grew up, and I don't know what passages were significant for you in coming to a traditional perspective, but for me it was very much not the 7 clobber passages around homosexuality. It was Genesis 1 and 2. And it was that Genesis 1 and 2 is this beautiful story about marriage primarily. And I actually don't believe that that's the point of that story. Because the main problem in the Genesis account, I don't think it's sin abstractly. The first problem in the very, very good story that God is telling, that God self says in God's own words is very, very good, is not that Adam doesn't have a wife, it's that Adam is alone. And so when I understood the problem of the story of Genesis to be about aloneness, not like loneliness, just the feeling, but like a lifelong experience of being alone that I had been calling my queer students to, I think I just missed something for me in the scriptures. And I felt like God spoke to me in the scriptures of that need to help people eradicate aloneness in them. And so the issue of life and death meeting community changed everything for me.
Yes. Well, I don't know if we can ask each other questions, but maybe like...
Just go with the flow.
Okay. In the discovery for you, coming out of your time with InterVarsity and into this new, I'm sure there was a significant weight there. How did God bring you, how did God heal that? I guess would be my question. Or do you feel like it's still a work in progress?
I mean, I think it was through my students.
Yeah.
Like, I watched my students. So I had a student named Emily, and Emily was a part of one of the conservative mega churches on campus when I worked at the U of O for 5 years as a campus minister. And Emily joined that group, and I felt like God had said to me, like, stay in Emily's life even though she's not a part of your ministry. And I was like, oh, it's the worst. Like, you were like, want to develop leaders and have them like join your ministry, make your ministry bigger, and do the whole like take the campus for Jesus bit. And Emily was not a part of my ministry, and I met with her every month. And 8 months in, she came to me saying that she had fallen in love with her best friend, another woman, and that she had been kicked out of leadership in her spiritual community. And so I said, okay, come, like, be here. Because Emily was the most faithful Jesus follower I had met. I was like, I want this student to be my leader because she's like prayerful and in the scriptures, and she's going to church every week, and she's bringing her friends with her. She's like doing all the Jesus stuff. And this community is seeing this one thing and saying that it isn't enough. And I think that maybe the concept that feels real to me in that, and where I think some healing has happened, is recognizing that this is not a primary issue in Scripture. And I think it's part of where, when we start to divorce ourselves from denominations, that's usually the dissonance, is that a denomination or a community will say, this is not a primary issue like baptism, salvation, the Word of God and how we think about it. Like, we say it's not that kind of issue, because those are the issues that we'll divorce our communities over. But then when this one comes to the surface, suddenly we're like, well, maybe that one too. And so when I saw that play out in Emily's life, and then watched her gather a group of queer students to study the Bible together every week, and watch them be way more faithful in their sexual practices and their relationships and their love for one another than my straight students were, I just had to ask, like, which one is being faithful here? Like, sure. If we're doing like a sheep and goat situation, like, it's these queer students. And so their spirituality invited me more deeply into faithfulness, which I think was deeply healing for me. So I guess in that, I wonder how encountering those, because one of the tensions I feel in your story is how you have folks behind you who I'm sure are like, these are not the people I like thought you were going to reach. Sure. And then you're holding a tension of having folks who might be interpreted as living in sin in your community. And in my communities, that would have been considered a way of polluting the like theological purity of your community. Right. So I'm curious how you held the intersection in the midst of that, because I think that that can be a space where it could be deeply challenging to try to be, because it sounds like in like a really good way, like Jesus, it's like a wounding, like a good wounding as you walk down the street to encounter and be broken for students. Yes. But then to have this institutional tension existing at the same time feels like it could break something in a person. So I'm curious how you interacted with that.
Well, my time in LA, I was an arbiter of these stories, and I was very protective of them to the point to where I didn't trust to tell any of my leaders. And so when I was giving updates about our church plant, I was like, yeah, we're hanging out with people on the fringe, and it's spicy. And so to tack on to that, the college that I graduated from, you sign a piece of paper saying you're not going to drink. They called it the claw. You're not going to like have sex, and you're not going to, be gay. And that also changed me when one of the students got kicked out of school for that reason, and was spiritually homeless, and like people just stopped talking to them. And I was like, what is going on? And this person started coming to our community with his boyfriend. And I'm like, Lord, and the Lord's like, your job is to introduce them to Jesus, is to push him towards me. That's your only job. And I have never felt, nor do I feel called to make anybody straight. I don't feel called to be enlightenment in regards to someone's sexual preference. I am called to show people, hey, this is good news, here's Jesus. And and so that changed me. And in that period, there was a process happening in me where the Lord's like, don't, and a lot of what Paul said, don't do my job for me, because you will suck at it, and you will hurt people, and you will, so let me be the arbiter of the narrative, teach them, open your Bible, what is Jesus saying? And I'm telling you, around this table, every single Sunday, everyone open their Bible, and everyone, what is God speaking to you? Boom. Hearing the voice of God. And so the identity portion, all of that is Jesus. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. It's not marriage. It's not having 10 kids. You know, that's great. That's great. I'm single. I'm 45 years old. And these are things that I am holding myself to as well. Like, there are things that I have to put on the altar every single day. And I'm like, but where's Jesus at the end of that? And that is my question to them. And so that has been tethering me in this and allowing Jesus to be Jesus as I share these stories with my pastors, with my leaders, and with my friends. And that's also, you know, in some areas I'm the liberal Harvard person, and in other areas I'm, you know, should be a little bit more affirming. And so I live in that space and in that tension.
You guys began to touch on some of this, but how have you navigated the tension that you guys have both spoken to between theology and practice? Where, you have each of you hold a strong belief, and even right now you are engaging in this exercise, this community as sisters in Jesus.
Yes.
To navigate this. So what has been helpful in navigating that tension between the theological conviction and then that practice of showing up in whatever space you find yourself in?
I'll go first this time. You've been going first. I don't want to do that too, but it makes me think of Nadia Bolz-Weber, actually, who I don't agree with theologically, but also love. I mean, in some things I do, and in other things I'm like, oh, okay, and that's fine, right? I'm like, oh, that's great, but she said she wrote a book called Pastrix, and she used this quote, and also Jerry Cook, which I wrote his quote in, and I didn't even know, Paul Young, that you had a relationship with Jerry Cook, who is a pastor who has since passed away. But she says, every time we draw a line between us and others, Jesus is always on the other side of it. And I feel like in my journey theologically, I am also brought to Andy Crouch talking about personhood and talking about the greatest commandment, which is loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that this is true flourishing, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Like, if we're going to dissect, like, what does it mean to be a whole person? It is to love the Lord. It's allness, with all and with everything. And then I think also of Abraham, and I think of Abraham and Sarah's identity for a long time was being a barren, this barren couple, until they have Isaac and Ishmael. And what does God do? He says, take your promise, take the thing that I promised, and I want you to put it on the altar and sacrifice it. And so all of my loves, my loyalties, my desires will all get put on an altar at some point in time. And theologically, I think the thing that I'm always going to anchor myself in is that that's where Jesus is. That if it's not if it's not Jesus, then he's going to ask for it. And that makes me extremely uncomfortable, and it keeps me in a very humble position because it keeps me on both sides of that line. And that might be a cop-out, but it's really hard. And like Paul said, loving is really hard. And it's dangerous, and it's messy, and a lot of times I'm like, am I doing this right? And I have to go back and I have to repent and I need to try again. And so that is kind of where I feel like my theological tension is. It's in learning and unlearning and going back and forth and trying to be this.
I hear that, and I think, okay, I do not know how to do this in this room, and so I'm just going to do my best, which is that I think that we are both really nice people. Like, we're nice people, we're both pastoral folks, and I think that to make these conversations, like, feel where we feel them, requires the temperature in the room to be like hot enough that we're all sweating a little bit. And I'm not trying to like really do that in some kind of like pragmatic way. You know, I'm not trying to be like, oh, let's just make it uncomfy for fun. Why would I do that? Like, I don't know where you all stand. This could be like a dangerous position for me to be in some way. So I want to be careful about how I show up.
We're here for it.
And when I think about like some of the things you're describing, I see a lot of limits, right? So when I think about, here's where I just like step on the toes of every person you've ever liked in any context. But when I think about like the Center for Faith, Gender, and Sexuality, that's Preston Sprinkle's organization, people who are entering into third way spaces, spaces that might welcome LGBTQ plus folks, but maybe not be affirming, or maybe are affirming, or have like kind of unclear sentiments about human sexuality, those spaces very frequently lean on this kind of metric of articulating what you believe as a spiritual practice. So as my partner and I have talked about getting married, and as we're engaged to be married, we've talked about how do we engage with people in our lives who aren't affirming. So we're like, well, let's just see what Preston Sprinkle's organization says about this, because it actually feels like really helpful to know how do we hold a space with folks who are non-affirming, while also trying to be like, well, how do we invite people to our wedding, and what does that mean? And there's this resource that we came across that was like 6 responses that you can give to someone if they invite you to a queer wedding. And we were like, great, like that's what we want to see. And it's either all but 1 or all but 2 of the 6 responses start with some version of the sentiment, I need you to know that I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and it might be, and so I'm not going to your wedding. Or, so I am going to your wedding, but I need you to know that I disagree. And I think that that's kind of the thing on the edge of all of these conversations, right? Is like, we say, okay, we're traditional and we love, but like, when it comes down to how we show up in each other's lives, the tension becomes more palpable. And so I think I have like some thoughts and a question about that, which is like, how do you navigate that space between theology, practice, sacrament, and people's actual lives? Because in my opinion, and you can feel free to push back on this, I'm very, very open to that. Like, I'm so open to that. But I feel like that posture of articulating what you believe as some kind of primary godly truth serves like maybe 2 ideas. One, that God is really weak, which actually I love about your story, is that you said, like, we open the Bible every week. So this is actually not about you. You know, like, I think that sometimes in these conversations you can be like, but you said, like, we open the Bible every week and students hear Jesus. Because I think that there's this low view of God that says, I need to articulate my disagreement in order that a person hear the truth, or that God's word be defended. I'm like, God doesn't need you to do that. Like, that's not our job. Or it's a really low view of people. Like that other people just haven't heard the truth enough, or like haven't heard enough of a traditional perspective, when for my whole life I've swam in a deep, deep water of conservative Christian perspectives on this. And I have engaged with them rigorously. And so I'm wondering how we hold those things, right, as we like kind of turn that temperature up a little bit, between the actual practices that we do and the limits that we give to people in their participation. Because I think for me as an affirming person, and I was affirming before I knew I was queer, and like years before, and so it wasn't like, because I've heard this very uncharitable response, which is like, oh, you're affirming so that you can justify your own lifestyle. I was like dating men up until a year and a half ago. Like, I was really trying to be straight, you know, like in a hetero marriage. It didn't happen, right? Like, so I'm wondering how you hold those things, because I think that there's like, it feels like there's a wall in where traditional perspectives that are loving and welcoming hit the reality of queer folks' lives. So I don't know.
No, and thank you very much. I mean, and that is the space where I feel that someone would say, like, I'm dangerous, right? And I don't mean that, like, and I'm not, like, personally, but just in my, like, I couldn't get in a street fight to save my life, but even like this morning, I'm like, this is the question that, I mean, or this is kind of the space where thank you for articulating that very well. And I don't know. I don't know.
Thanks, Paul.
This is what I do know. I do know that that in my attempt to follow and to obey the invitation of Jesus in all of these specific situations, because they're all different. I wish I could give like a blanketed, you know, how to, and if you do these 3 things, then you'll be golden. Except for Paul, I don't know. That was pretty golden. But it is only like through the Holy Spirit. And like I said, being like humbling myself and trying to be as honest as I possibly can in that space, even when I've had students and friends say, like, would you marry us? Like, would you do this? And I said, I can't. Like, I mean, I won't do that, which is equally heartbreaking. But also, I'm not going to pretend or to, and and just being honest in that space. And, even in my time during campus ministry as well, showing up in those spaces, but then also articulating, like, I can't sign that document because I don't agree with that theologically. And those are hard spaces for me. And I feel that way, and I bring it back to the Lord, and I'm like, okay, God, I pray for grace. And I pray that, that there's also another invitation, and there still is. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think I want to articulate in that obviously you held that grace carried into the ministry you did because you had students who came and stayed.
Sure.
Like, there is something in that. And I think that maybe part of the limitation of this conversation is that you represent a very particular expression of a traditional worldview, when I think when we come into a room like this, we're like as I think really practically, I'm like, okay, the GOP has put $26 million into anti-trans ads in swing states, when the number one issue in this election for most Americans is the economy. Why? Like, why $26 million into that? I'm like, oh, it's because there is this creating of an us and a them and a using of fear to create contexts that allow for the death and disposal of some people in the name of safety for others. That's not the perspective that you're bringing, right? And so I think this conversation feels like it feels like we can only get so far in disagreement because we're not holding the most extreme of positions that are on display that we're probably all feeling more than the conversation that we're hearing right now. So I think I feel some of like there's only so far we can take disagreement when we're trying, like when we are not holding the most extreme positions, when for a lot of queer folks who are entering into these conversations, we are assuming the most extreme position, which I don't think is fair. And for a lot of folks coming from traditional perspectives, it feels like an issue of life and death, and that might feel like something in someone's body. And so it feels really difficult to say, like, well, I've grown up my whole life hearing that, like, the wrath of God came over queer folks in New Orleans, and that's why there was a hurricane. Like that was like a thing John Piper said. Yeah. Like, John Piper said that. And that's like the water a lot of us have swam in. And so I think that there's some visceral body things that come up that I can see even in our own bodies, where we're kind of like, how do we do this when that extreme position sits in the undercurrent of all that we're talking about, even as our personal relationships for you and I, it seems like, sit at the very surface of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, a pastor had tweeted about, like, the YMCA, like, allowing transgender people to use, the bathroom with which, and he had tweeted, like, there goes my membership. And I'm like, well, what if you just showed up in there and, like, started a relationship and they blocked me? And it is this very, like, it is kind of this interesting space, that also, I will say, I am grateful for it, because I can only imagine the spaces that you live in every single day and that you've had to traverse. And so awkwardness and discomfort, I'm like, okay. This is the privilege and the gift that, like, is the invitation of obedience to Jesus, and I have to trust him with that. And so, yeah. And also, it is why, like, some of these stories were hard. Like, they would stop here for me, because I'm like, being misunderstood, is, I mean, up until like 10 years ago, my worst fear was being called a liberal. Okay, like, can I just be honest? Like, if someone were to say, like, you're too liberal, I'd be like, oh my gosh, like, my witness, like, what is happening? And that's just the honest truth. And there has been transformation in that for me, because the Lord's like, okay, like, we need to do some work. Like, you need to trust me. And part of that, and amazingly enough, was through a Tim Keller message. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, my self-righteousness is literally killing me. And so trying to bring that into, these spaces of like, okay, Lord, what is the invitation here? And I think continuing that posture has kept me, number one, like tethered to the Holy Spirit. And number two, really trying to be a very good listener. And not weaponizing.
Yes.
But again, like these are all very big words.
Yes.
And hopefully the witness of our life shows those things.
Well, and I think conceptually some of this, what I'm hearing is like this, and even in like the YMCA thing, is like this issue of resilience. Because I think people that come, and this is not a dig as much as I can not make it a dig, and maybe it's a dig a little bit, but I think people who hold a traditional perspective around human sexuality are not taught resilience around resistance to that perspective. And so when we start to have conversations about human sexuality that deviate from the most traditional perspective, people implode on themselves like dying stars. Like start to get defensive internally, start to posture and play holiness, and start to do things, because that to me, that like block instantly on a YMCA, or like block you instantly, or YMCA, I'm like, that is a lack of resilience. For folks who would call me a snowflake for my liberalism, that's like some snowflake behavior, right? Like that's what that is. And so I think that oftentimes people who come from a traditional perspective do not have the inner resilience to have these conversations effectively without freaking out or feeling like their entire relationship with Jesus and the Bible is falling apart. And I think that's part of where, when you talked about the burden of disagreement, why I care about that concept so much. Because my church became started going through the process of becoming affirming 3.5 years ago. And what we saw was that folks who were queer had already wrestled for years and years and years with this issue, had done the rigorous work, had tried really hard, I have read every resource. If you come from a traditional perspective, if you have read that book, I have read it twice. I have read every affirming, which there are far fewer books because we privilege in church publishing the things that we say we believe. And so there just are fewer resources because they haven't been privileged. And every queer person I know has not come to an affirming position lightly. And I think that there's a way that there's this kind of unresilient, disingenuous, uncharitable interpretation of folks who are affirming by folks who come from a traditional perspective, because there hasn't been any kind of inner resilience. And so I think that a lot of the conversations we have to be around developing the resilience to be disagreed with, and to maybe be wrong, or maybe to be wrong on something. Because I guarantee for all of our sexual ethics, we're wrong on something. Guaranteed. Like, guaranteed. And I think that uncharitable assumption that folks who come to an affirming position don't care about the Bible or are not rigorous ignores the fact that a lot of people who have come to traditional perspectives have never applied rigor to their own theology. John is in the back.
Oh, I wasn't asking a question. I was
Yeah, just a fist bump.
Although, can I say something?
Please.
Can we make this weird?
Yeah.
I've noticed, I'm trying to think of how to say this. I know certain people who had a conservative view of what we're discussing, and then they have a child who comes out. And so I have 2 children, right? And nieces and nephews, all these children. And I can imagine that like one of them, whether it's one of my children or a niece and nephew, comes out. And I've noticed that when that happens, it's kind of to use a try-turn, rubber meets the road type of situation. And I don't even know where I'm going with this, but there's something about the paternal love for just somebody, like when I think of my daughter and my son. If my son comes to me and he tells me he's gay, and I hold that conservative perspective, there's a tension there that I think is so real for so many Christians right now on both sides of the debate. So there are some parents, right, who they hold fast to their conservative theology, and then maybe they do their best to love their child somehow in that. There are others that jump completely to the other side, and because I worked at a PCUSA church for years, they start going to the PCUSA church because they can't abide. Like, they literally can't be in a church that will use certain language about their children. And so I'm not asking a question, but I think there are probably, I just think there are so many parents and people who are dealing with this, where someone they know is either talking about their sexual identity or their gender identity. And so I want to hear you talk about that, because I think so many people are lost and they don't know where to go. They don't know where to land on the issues. So I feel very passionate about it, because when I imagine my daughter, coming to me and telling me she's gay, like, I know how I'm going to react, because I could never in a million years alienate her. I would never in a million years want to do that. And I can't imagine my theology, my belief in a loving God, forcing me to alienate her. But I do think some conservative parents arrive at that place thoughtfully. So I'm sorry, that's a lot.
It's important.
It is very
It's the center of a lot of these conversations and why a lot of us come to care about it.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I've been next to those children. And I mean, I think, again, like what Paul said earlier, just about that posture of, I mean, talking to your atheist friend about, his belief, like, what do you believe in? And I think that front and center before the presence of God, I mean, again, like, I'm not going to give a blanketed answer for that, other than the fact of we don't, like, the bottom line is love. And we're not here to, like, I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's healthy. I think we point them to Jesus always. And what is Jesus saying to you? Where is Jesus at the end of this? And that's where, I mean, as a pastor, I would push a parent too.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that often comes up to that end of, like, how do we love well is, again, I don't want to keep using the word uncharitable, but I think that the way a lot of us are taught the traditional perspective is uncharitable by nature. And one of the things that happens when a kid, because I've seen this happen a million times, right? Do y'all know who Richard B. Hayes is? Okay, Richard B. Hayes is like an iconically conservative pastor, scholar, academic who wrote a book about New Testament theology that became the primary text that a lot of folks referenced for their anti-affirming views. His stuff is, like, at the center of a ton. It's like you're going to see it footnoted in Wayne Grudem's stuff. Like, in the most conservative stuff that you're going to find footnotes by Richard B. Hayes. In the last year, a book came out where Richard B. Hayes and his son wrote a book where Richard B. Hayes changed his mind. And a lot of people have come to him being like, your theology is watered down. Like, you've lost the gospel. You've instead of saying, hey, what is it that made you change your mind? And his response is essentially that, like, the grace of God is always ever opening, and it's the story of Jesus, is ever opening to new groups of people. If you read the book of Acts and you trace how people are included, it's they encounter somebody marginalized, the gospel gets bigger and covers more. They meet more people, the gospel gets bigger and covers more. And I think that there is this way that what happens is we will say, because a lot of us were taught that objectivity is God, that an objective view of the scriptures matters more than a relational experience with people who bear the image of God. And so what happens for a lot of parents or folks who become affirming when their kid comes out is that their friends will say to them, and I've heard this and I've walked through and pastored people through this, like, oh, this only matters to you now and you're only affirming because your kid is gay, as though that's a slur to that person. When I'm like, oh, imagine saying about any other issue, I got close to it and it changed my mind, and that is a bad thing. We only say it about this issue. So there's that part. But then I think we have to be compassionate to parents. Because I think that what happens is that we truncate the conversation into, oh, if my parent isn't affirming and I come out to them, like I'm engaging this in my own life right now, like and they're not affirming, then like, what do I do? That's a real question, because I know friends whose parents haven't gone to their weddings, who've disowned them over their being queer. Like folks who wanted their dad to walk them down the aisle, their parents say no. They say they won't come. They articulate their theological views over and over again and believe that to be faithfulness to Jesus. And that tells me that parents are hurting. And what often is happening is that parents aren't just having a difficult conversation about whether they think their kid is going to hell now that they know that their kid is queer. They're asking a question about like, what did I do as a dad that made my son gay? Because that's the messaging that we got in a lot of like James Dobson-esque ideology, is like, if you didn't punish your child enough, your child might become sexually perverse. That's his language. And so a lot of parents have this visceral reaction to hearing that their kid is queer because it feels like a personal failure, it feels like a theological failure, and it is also this deep grieving of what they thought their life and family would be. Like if you thought that you were gonna have a son-in-law and suddenly your daughter is dating a woman and you're gonna have a daughter-in-law and your friends are all in a conservative church, when a child comes out of the closet, parents go into the closet and they have to figure out ways to engage. And so I think there is a mutual grief that is happening. I won't say it's the same in scale or intensity or implication, but I think there is a compassion that we can have that I think that most parents are trying their best and often come to affirming conclusions after encountering the faithfulness of queer people in their lives.
Can I ask a general question? And that is, everybody in this room may think the same definition, but I need a definition of affirming. Because the question is affirming the love you have for another, or is it the agreement that you have with somebody's point of view?
That's a good question.
Yeah, what is the difference between affirming and welcoming?
And that's an even better question. Not a better question, but like it's a sharpening of that same question.
Sure.
Because I think you are welcoming, I am affirming.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
So I think affirming you can get into the weeds of it in some ways, but a lot of people would reduce it into a side A and side B. You can remember side A for affirming. It's not really what it is, but that's how I remember it. And side B being a more traditional perspective that says that the only relationships that God honors is a marriage relationship, a monogamous, lifelong relationship between a man and a woman. That's like the kind of basic, am I missing anything really important about that?
Yeah.
I think you can add a lot of purity culture stuff to that, but I think that's it's all extra biblical, so I don't think that's helpful. And then to say that one is affirming says that God also affirms, so that's the language of affirming, the sacredness of same-sex or, right, when we think about our trans kin and siblings, multi-gendered relationships. And so it is to say that like when I go to an altar with my partner in a year, that God honors that relationship as God would honor a straight relationship.
And I have a question too, kind of following that up. So where is the boundary in the LGBTQ plus? So like, I mean, or can I say that?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I guess, because, I mean, even in thinking through this, like, conversation, I mean, I told Andy and Brandy, I'm like, I am not an apologist. Like, I just have stories. That's kind of, like, where I stop here. But, you know, I think sexual ethics, like, we need healthy boundaries in that. And where does that, I mean, and is that part of the affirming and then the non-affirming? Like, having boundaried relationships, and then not, like, where would that make me non-affirming? If that makes sense. I don't know if I said that correctly.
I think it's a fair question because I think it taps at an assumption that a lot of us make about queer folks in general, and I'm not saying it's the assumption you're making, but I think it is a broader question, which is that, like, queerness in and of itself is sexually lawless, because that is what we were taught. Like, when I think about the 1980s and the Ronald Reagan-esque rhetoric about queer folks, it was that queer folks are the definition of depravity. But when I think about people who are following Jesus who are queer, most of those folks are more conservative in a lot of ways around how they practice their sex lives, their actual sex lives and sexuality, than a lot of my heterosexual students were in their ministries. Yeah. And so I think there's this challenging thing where we might ask that question about limits for queer folks, but we have a lot of grace for heterosexual folks whose relationships are dysfunctional as hell. And we know that because the divorce rate is egregious. that the adultery rate among evangelical men in particular is egregious. And so the issue for me is not the limitations necessarily within queerness or like what the limits are within the LGBTQ community. It's what kind of sexual culture are we creating that in the church is creating such problematic men, honestly, because that's a huge part of the issue. Like when I think about level of pornography addiction, adultery, violence, those sorts of things, we don't address those things very effectively. And so I'm not saying like this, because it could feel like I'm being like whataboutism. That's not what it is. It's to say that I think that there's a higher sexual ethic that we can all hold, but I do think there are limits.
Absolutely. No.
Because I think that like, I think that the Bible like cares about monogamy. I think that's true. And I'm like, that's one of the limits that I think for me in my own theology I hold. Do I have friends who are in polyamorous relationships? Yes. Is that my business? Not really. If they ask me about it, yeah, like, sure, we'll talk about it, but is that my business? Not really. And so I think that there are some limits that we can have, but I think the limits are the same. If I'm affirming, the limits are the same as they are for straight folks. Like,
Yeah.
like I don't know why we would assign a different standard to queer folks that we would to straight folks, unless we hold an assumption about the inherent deviance of queerness, which I think in some ways a traditional perspective does require.
Well, and I will say, I mean, I think getting into polyamorous and different expressions of that, I would probably, that pushes on, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not, like, and that's just my own, I guess, ignorance on that, but.
Well, I think I'm saying that we would probably agree on the Bible's
Sure.
called monogamy.
Sure,
Like,
yeah.
I'm not actually asking, I'm not expressing disagreement on that. I'm more saying that, like, if the Bible holds people to standards around concepts, not configurations,
Yes.
like, if marriage is not about primarily heterosexuality, and it's about self-giving, self-sacrificing, faithful love for another person that is lifelong, then that's the standard. Like, I think that it's easy because we see queerness as in churches with more traditional perspectives as inherently sinful, that we map that onto people's lives before we look at their practices. Like, and I think that's pretty unfair. And so I think we have to do a lot of assumption checking about what we assume queer folks are doing and where we get those messages. And one of the questions I ask is, how did this become so important to you? Not you, Janelle, but like when I have a visceral reaction to my queer students being in a relationship when I was in InterVarsity, I had to ask, like, why is this so important to me? Like, why do I feel the need to get in their business when like these two students are having sex before they're married, and I'm supposed to tell them that that's bad by the standards of my organization?
Right.
And I feel strongly about this one in my body, and I feel very, very lenient on this one because it's just what kids do. Like, do queer folks get to be kids? Like, do queer folks get to have relationships? Do queer folks get to live lives where we're not alone? And I think for me, that's one of the foundational questions. And I think it's where traditional perspectives have limits for me, because what we will invite people to is celibacy without any structures to hold what a romantic relationship or a lifelong partnership does for a person.
Well, I mean, that's my reality right now. I am straight, but I am single, and I don't expect that I will probably get married for the rest of my life. So, you know, the invitation there would be the same as others that I have, other people that would say that they would classify themselves as gay, but they're like, I'm going to live a celibate life. And that's why it is, like, community is essential, and it's so important. Like, the church, we have a job to stand in that middle with, I believe, and be family. And our household right now, I have 2 other women that live with us, and that's kind of the space that we hold. We have 1 meal a night, and these are things that we invite other people to as well, and I have seen that happen with my gay brothers and sisters that are choosing celibacy. Yeah, but.
Can I ask like one more, like, raise the temperature question a little bit on that? How do you engage them with the idea of choice in that? Or like, because you might say, because I'm not saying that you're single because you want to be, I don't know your story, right? But it seems like for queer folks, you have to make the decision to be celibate. and therefore cut off all other options for your life. Like for folks I know who are queer and celibate, it means that they're cutting themselves off from the possibility of a romantic relationship, not just like the circumstances. And so I'm curious how you hold that, because that feels like, I don't want to dishonor your story, right? Because I feel like there's...
I'm not trying to compare and contrast either, because I mean, it is an unfair ask.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm wondering is like, how do you, or how did you, or how have you held that with students? Because I don't think that it's, what I want to say is like, not every queer person is affirming, and like, that's fine. Yeah. And when we ask people to choose a life of celibacy or to opt into celibacy, there's a cost underneath that that I don't think folks who hold traditional perspectives who are asking people to do that understand. And I think that you're in actually a pretty unique space to understand that. And so I'm wondering maybe if there's advice that you would have for folks who might be viscerally kind of oriented to asking people towards celibacy to know what the costs are of that, because I think that that's not something we think about very much when we just apply a biblical solution to what feels like a sin problem for people.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it is a huge opportunity for the church to enter into spaces that we don't already exist in. And I mean, and I'll just be frank, like having one conversation with a friend of mine, and we're about the same age, and, you know, he said, my biggest fear is that, you know, I'll come to church on Sunday and then all of a sudden it's going to be okay. Like the church is going to say, like, you can get married now. Like we're yes, like 2 thumbs up. And my question to him was like, okay, but what is Jesus inviting you to? Like, is this an invitation from Jesus? Like, again, like default, and I don't mean that as a cop out, but it isn't. I'm not going to sit there and say, like, you need to be celibate. You need to do this. I'm like, what is the invitation of Christ in this space? And some of his invitations aren't fair. Some of them I don't understand. Honestly, I wouldn't choose celibacy. Okay? That's just being honest. But that is the invitation of Jesus, and I have to put that on the altar. I feel like it's suffering in some points. And if that's the invitation of obedience from Jesus for them, then okay. Then as the church, he's going to also invite me to support and to show up and to hold their hand and to invite them over for dinner. Like, there's not a holiday that's going to go by where you don't have an invitation. You have a place at our table. You know, and all of these life things, there is room here for you. You're not an inconvenience. You're not an afterthought. You're family. And I think the church has an opportunity to be a lot better at that than we are currently.
Yeah, I appreciate the empathy you bring in that.
I think an important part that you touched on there, Janelle, is that you're asking them to seek Jesus, and you're trusting them to hear Jesus. You've demonstrated a willingness to walk with people when they hear something that you didn't think they would hear, and a willingness to walk with them when it is a hard answer. It's kind of something that I hear you saying that I would think is maybe largely lacking often from what Paul was saying of don't tell me what you know, but tell me what you hear. Like, to affirm the person's ability to hear Jesus, and as you've been talking about, holding that, trusting them to hear Jesus, right? Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely. And again, this is not easy. This is not easy. I mean, my same friend said, my biggest fear is dying alone. And that broke my heart. And I said, well, he's an MIT grad. And I'm like, well, you know, we all die alone. But I had to be a little cheeky in there. But at the same time, I understood. I mean, I was trying to empathize with his weight, because that is a big fear of mine too. I'm like, am I going to be an afterthought? You know? And Jesus is like, do you trust me? Do you trust me? And those are hard conversations. And Brandy, I think also witness is so important. So it's like, don't tell me these things. Like, do you have a plan for Thanksgiving? Like, do you have a plan for my birthday? Do you have a plan for, like, hey, I'm going to the hospital and I'm gonna get tests done. Like, who's holding your hand? Like, who's filling your fridge? Who's calling you? A pastor of a church, she's a teaching pastor. She lost her husband, and her senior leader's like, "Are you going to dedicate your son?" And she's just like, "I can't. Like, my husband's gone. Like, I can't even think about that." And he's like, "Would you just trust the Lord?" So she does, and all these men stood up in the congregation, you know, upon this time, and she's just so broken, and she's, you know, weeping. And between the now and the not yet is the church. Like, we hold that tension, and it's messy, and and our call is to, like, sit in suffering and to sit in that in between, in that messy middle. And we don't do it perfectly, but we show up. How are we showing up? And whether you're affirming or not affirming, you show up.
Where I get sort of friction in myself is when I feel like I'm being asked to affirm an ideology, and on both the Christian side and on the LGBTQ side, that there emerges an ideology that I have to affirm in order to be affirming, rather than the moment-by-moment response to the person who's actually in front of me. And so I'm not interested in affirming an ideology. I'm really interested and want in every way to affirm the person who's in front of me. And I'm with guys on death row, right? And they love me and I love them. And it's never about affirming an ideology. To me, that feels like something that stands between me and that person.
Will you define ideology?
An ideology is, how would I put it? And I'll take all the help that I get. Framework? Yeah, it's a framework that sits above. As if, for example...
Held as right? Held as correct?
Held as right. Let me put it this way. Does marriage serve love, or does love serve marriage? Because in that sense, marriage becomes the ideology that love is supposed to serve. No. Was the Sabbath made for human beings, or human beings made for the Sabbath? The ideology sits above, and you end up serving the ideology rather than being an expression of love. I may not be saying this very right, and very difficult. Oh, I'm just trying to find language for the tension that I feel in myself. So that it's not about me. It's like the guy that has all the papers in the front row, front pew of that congregation. I'm frankly not interested in serving the ideology that he is going to present to me from that stack of papers and the Bibles as he translates it. That's the ideology. What do I hear in any given moment? And it's not going to be, well, I've got to put it through the grid of some kind of an external ideology in order to know that I am functioning and acting like a loving human being. I want to be the expression of love, and I'm not concerned about the ideology. I'm really not.
That to me feels easier to say if you're coming from a dominant perspective.
But I'm not. To have a dominant perspective, I have to have the ideology.
But to have no ideology is to create danger for a person for whom ideology has been weaponized. So for me, so I'll say it differently. If I go to someone in my life, if I go to the pastor of my church and I say I'm queer, I am extending a ton of trust to that person. And if I am doing that with every interaction I have around every step of my life, the cost for me is much higher than the cost for the person that I am interacting with. So when my partner comes out to her parents and it goes in a hard direction, every subsequent conversation is one where she has to bring something in herself to come to them again. And so I think in what you're saying, I don't want to be dismissive, but it assumes that your love and your rightness is welcoming enough that it doesn't cost me something to come to you in order to do that. And I don't think that's true. And I think even if like Andy, even if you individually are like so affirming, but I come to your church and someone says something sideways to me and my partner, that's going to erode trust. And generations of traditional theology and the damage it's done to queer communities creates distrust that isn't about an individual, it's about systems and people. And so even as you talk about principalities and powers, I'm like, the principalities and powers impact the risk it is for me to come to a person to allow myself to be loved. Do I want to be loved? Yes, but the risk is high, and I think sometimes that cost is too much to ask people to pay. So I don't know what to do with that.
It feels like we're talking about two different things. Completely. That's the way it feels to me. And because I can't guarantee anybody else's response around me, regardless of the kind of environment. And all I can do is live inside my own embodied existence in response to that which is actually in front of me. And if I am in a system, then I'm going to fight the system when it makes it more difficult for you. I'll fight on your behalf, regardless of the ideology involved. And so I think we're talking apples and oranges a bit. At least that's the way it feels to me. And that could be very much that I totally misunderstand what's going on.
I think I just think that ideology matters. Like, I think abstraction at some point doesn't serve us when, maybe to me it feels like it's living in the land of like hypotheticals rather than like in like reality or something. Because I think like if Andy, I said to you like, I don't affirm your relationship with your wife, that would be pretty hard for you to interact with, I think, in some ways. If I said that that was not something that was like honored by God, and I just said that just to say that to you, it'd be an ideological difference that we would be holding, but it has a really practical implication on how I'm in relationship with you. And so I think I think I'm wondering how we pull from the abstraction and the like ideas into a real situation where that happens, because I think that feels more practical to me, and I don't know that that's maybe where we're at, but I think that's maybe what I'm feeling.
Let me get to this last bit here. And then tomorrow, everybody who can come to the lunch, we're going to have a Q&A where you can ask particulars of Brandy and Janelle, where we actually had intended to stray away from some of what we went into tonight, which is okay. But for, affirming folks in the room, you may have some questions for Janelle, and for traditional folks in the room, you may have some questions for Brandy, or it doesn't have to be crisscross. It could be whatever. But be thinking about those questions and try to think about how to ask them succinctly tomorrow. Even write it down, and if you want to give it to me tomorrow before lunch, we did that last time, and that went great. But I do want to get to just this final sort of practical question of practice tonight, and then the final question that was in our outline, we'll start with that tomorrow. But the final question tonight is, what sort of practices, or just what in general, has been most helpful to you personally in navigating painful experiences and conversations in difficult relationships? Like, how have you both built the resiliency to continue to be people of grace in the midst of this? Yeah, and we'll close with that for tonight, and then
For me, it's just showing up and continuing to show up, especially in my denomination and denominational spaces, showing up, knowing that there is a very big margin of being misunderstood, living in that, living in a misunderstood space, both in my Foursquare family, and then also with my queer brothers and sisters as well. And again, Jesus, where are you, like, in this space? And how do what's my yes? What is the invitation in that? And fear.
Yeah.
Fear is a big one.
Huge.
Putting it on the altar and saying, Lord, like, and the mantra from the Lord, I mean, we are always climbing higher elevations in our faith, just like, there's a bigger, like, ask and a bigger, but the mantra is always like, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Do you trust me? And inviting that same invitation in those spaces as well. Showing up and being a part of our conversations in a doctrine committee and in committees like within our denomination, sparring back and forth and telling these stories. And then again, like, showing up for on Zoom with my church from LA, which during COVID, like, resurrected again, and they were like, hey, we want church, like, and so doing that. And again, like, holding that posture before the Lord.
I think for me, it's been to assume that we're all doing the best that we can. Like, I think when I have a hard response from someone in my life, when I come out to them, or when I, like, share that I'm engaged and they're, like, really excited about another part of my life but not excited about this one, assuming that they're doing the best they can. And, like, that might hurt me in some way. That might be a fracture in our relationship in some way. But I can assume that they're doing the best that they can. And if their best comes to a point where it, like, causes a ton of harm to me, that I can make choices in and out of those spaces and don't have to feel the need to articulate to those folks necessarily why, because I think sometimes it's, like, kind of obvious. But I think if I assume that people are doing the best that they can, then I can see the inch by inch movement that people are making. Like, when my partner's non-affirming parents say yes to something, to, like, meeting me for the first time, or to having a dinner with me, or when I was going to ask them if, like, when I was going to talk to them about marrying her, they've said yes a lot of times. And I can look at all the tension and the challenge and let that be the whole story. Or I can assume that they're in their own process of grief, that they're on their own journey, that they may never land in the same place that my partner and I do, and that they're doing the best that they can. And I can't ask them to do better than the best that they can. And then my commitment gets to be to do the best that I can to meet them where they are, insofar as I am able to do that. And so I think if I assume that people are doing their best, unless they really prove that they're not, which I think is like $26 million in anti-trans ads and, the news, like, that's when I'm like, well, okay, I'm not gonna really do that. But, like, if you give me any evidence that you're doing the best you can, I'm going to offer you the grace to say, yes, you are. And I think if we can offer each other the grace to say that we're doing the best that we can, that we're being as faithful as we all know how to be to Jesus and what we know of Jesus right now, that goes a really long way. And that's changed how I view people and how I show up in my own life and how I show up in doing formation at my church. And yeah, it's made a huge difference.
Great conversation.
Right. Thank you guys so much. Brandy and Janelle, truly thank you. To do that in front of people cost both of you something. I want to name that, and thank you for the gift that you gave us by saying things that turned up the temperature, of holding positions that aren't always welcome, and yeah, thank you. We're going to bring Paul back up here for just a little Q&A, and we're going to close with some songs at the end of this. But like I said, we're doing Q&A with Brandy and Janelle after church tomorrow. So be thinking about those questions where you can get into some of the particulars. The first question that we are going to be asking both of them to start that time is, what are the misconceptions that people on the opposing side have of you? What are the assumptions that people make that are quite painful? And so we're going to make room for that tomorrow. But this is kind of free for all with Mr. Paul. And yeah, so if you have a burning question, somebody said it's going to take a long time to process everything he just said in your talk, which was wonderful. So does anybody have a question already for Paul? And I realized we weren't using the mic. I was speaking off mic. That was poor etiquette for the recording. So I'm going to give you a mic if you have a question.
Good, we're done.
Okay. I'll start with one. Say, and you touched on this, and it made me think of this song by John Guerra, How Long, where he says, your grace isn't good till it's spent. And I love that line, and something you said to me back in January is, as I was, in your words, future tripping about the what ifs and what ifs, and you said...
you don't get grace today for things that don't exist?
Yes. Tell us more about the immediate presence of grace and how that plays out in our life.
So, and I think this is, at least for me in my journey, this has been one of the most significant places of trust I've ever had to deal with, and that is to stay present. And you have all of these scriptures that keep telling you, be anxious for nothing. There's no fear in love. And on and on and on. 365 times, fear not, I'm with you. Abide. Right? And anytime you use the word fear, almost 100% of the time you're dealing with some form of future tripping. You're no longer present. You're creating an imagination that doesn't exist. You're trying to solve a problem that right at this moment does not exist, because that person or that situation or that event is actually not here. Not right now, not in front of you. And in the presence is fullness of joy. I will keep the one whose mind is stayed on me in perfect peace. Right? So when peace is not present, you're the one that's gone. Right? When anxiety is what's here, you're not here. You're in somewhere else. And so whenever I talk to people about, and they dump their situations, which happens a lot, and I actually invite it in the sense that I want to be present with the person who's in front of me. And I mean, like tonight, my whole life from the moment of conception has led up to this conversation. Why would I want to be anywhere else? So being here right now is the real place of reality. This is where eternal life exists. How many things that we were all concerned and worried about ever actually happened and came about the way that we had imagined? Listen, I could have an aneurysm tonight and all the worry in my life would have been gone. And I can sit with every person, and two things come up with in almost every conversation, and that is future tripping, they're not present. And the other one is the issue of identity. Who are you really? And it wraps around those two things. But this thing about doing the work to stay present to the world as it is in this moment is work. We are so used to not being here, but being in some imagination that does not actually exist. And when I said you don't get grace today for things that don't exist, a lot of our prayers are for things that don't exist. And you're saying, and God's like, it doesn't exist, but I imagine that it does, right? But it's not real, but it could be, right? And so you have all of these various spin-offs, and you're not here. That which is promised to us is peace, joy, love, the sense of the kindness of God. Even in the dark night, the joy is still there. And so how many of our problems would be resolved if we died? Like most of them. Right? How many of the things are we worried about would be resolved if we died? Like a lot of them. And so it's like, why am I spending so much of my life and energy and everything else trying to control my world? And I think it's important to understand that trust and control are mutually exclusive, like love and fear are. Love and fear are opposed like trust and control are. And so, again, I got an email from a woman that I had met, and we'd had lunch together, and she said, I don't know if you remember this, but a couple of years ago, we had lunch together, and she said, I dumped on you, and your response was, so in this moment, right here, right now, is there anything that you can do about these situations? And she said, I thought, and then I said, well, no. And then she said, you said, well, then pass the salt. So she says, every time I start to future trip, I hear, pass the salt. Because it's a real thing. Salt is actually real. It's way more real than your imagination, which when it's wed to fear, those imaginations are traumatic and they're destructive and they drive you out of presence and into an imagination where you are alone and disempowered. That's where it's going to take you. In the presence, you're surrounded. And what I advise people is if you cannot help but future trip, because when you start being aware of this, it's going to be like 150 times the first day. And if you can't help but future trip, at least ask Jesus to go with you. Because that violates the aloneness part of future tripping imagination. And so again, people will talk about their greatest fear or their greatest burden or their greatest fear, and the thing that's holding on to them right now, sitting on their shoulder, whatever. And almost every time it's about something that is future tense. An imagination of this, an imagination of this, you know, and it's because we are so used to not trusting that we want to create an imagination of a future, all right? What is it? Boy, it's hard not to be very specific because I've been listening to it quite a bit in terms of either conversations or things tonight. And that is, there is a lot of future tripping that is taking place. Even, and this is part of my struggle with ideology that came up, and I'm not an attacker at all. And the questions that I ask are real questions to me. And it's like, all right. But I don't want to imagine myself in a situation where such and such and such is taking place so that I can have a solution when it shows up, because it never shows up the way that I imagine. And usually at the bottom of it is, in me, something that is being driven by a fear of not having the right answer, or a fear of not being acceptable, or a fear, you know, all these other stupid things. You attach fear and imagination, you get fear-driven kinds of tragedies and traumas. You attach fear to love, you get play, you get creativity, you get childlikeness, you get adventure, you get all of these other things. And I guess, and I'm thinking about, okay, if I was listening to you, Paul, what would I say? How would I bring up the parts that you are not addressing very well? And I suppose that it would be, well, I was accused of this really recently. You are sacrificing truth in the name of love. That's what the accusation was. And you know, we need to speak the truth in love. And I'm like, no, in love, the truth is Jesus. So speak the presence of Jesus in the framework of love. So what about political ideology? Or what about, you know, governmental or business ideology? What about all those things? I don't know. And where does the person who doesn't know sit in the middle of all these things? Well, that would be me. Because there's a lot of things I don't know. I don't have a systematic way of which I've got everything figured out. I just don't. And so I don't know how to respond in a given situation. And frankly, I'm not willing to sacrifice that empty, fluid, responsive place on behalf of an ideology. I don't know if that makes any sense to you at all, and I'm kind of talking as I'm processing. So,
Well, we got one more question,
Okay,
then we're
good.
going to do
Good.
music. Here's Christy.
So, Paul, I think myself, I'm a teacher, and then I also help pastor my church. And a lot of us are sitting in this place of a lot of fear, looking at not just the fear, thinking future fear, but just fear about what's happening in our world or in our community, in our families, because there feels like there's so much at stake. And so I wonder how we walk through this. You know, we have access to so much information about tragedy.
You think that might be part of the problem?
Yes. But now that I know about it, I can't bury my head in the sand either, right? And so I can't, as much as I want to be present with the person who's right in front of me,
Okay.
I also don't want to ignore what I know is happening down the street or across the world.
Okay.
And so how do we
So-
hold those things?
So, in this moment, ask Jesus, what do you want me to understand about this? Whatever this is. And then ask, is there anything you want me to do about this right now? That's the only place that I know how to go, right? And it seems so simplistic. But otherwise, you're going to get rolled by all the information. What used to take 6 months to get to us in terms of news and all that kind of stuff, now is instantaneous. And so we got bombarded by that which will produce a response for not just the ones who are communicating it, but for the advertisers who are trying to sell stuff on, it's all so mixed up. And then somewhere in there is the loss of all the beautiful things that are happening all the time. And I'm an optimist. I think the whole planet is moving in a direction of restoration. And I think that it's happening. I hear and I get to see so many elements of it. We could go around the room and things that people are involved in, like Friends of the Carpenter. Is he still here? Yeah, I'm right. Okay. And, but things where, and I've got, Linda, who's 80-some years old, who just, the Lord, when she said, what do you want me to do about whatever it was on her heart? He just said, well, go to the houseless people and begin to just give them a bottle of water and hear their stories. Well, that's had a monumental ripple effect, not only in her life, but in the life of their community of faith and on and on. And, so she's with a couple who are houseless, and she says, well, I got to ask you a question. She says, why do you guys put your rings on your index finger and not on your ring finger? And he said, well, that's because when we start to have an argument and we start to point our finger, we will remember the covenant that we have. Right? So these little interactions begin to weave and ripple their ways. And I'm a huge believer that in each moment at a time, responding to the person who's in front of you creates a ripple effect. So, and I think it's the Holy Spirit that said, Paul, trust the ripples. Participate today in what's in front of you, because that's the only real world that exists for you. You can't solve the global problems. If you even begin to think about them, it'll just drop you right into a hole. So the real world is responding here and trusting the ripples, because that's the work of the Holy Spirit. And so, and maybe, I've got my head in the sand, and maybe all of this, on and on and on, but I can only speak in terms of where I'm at, and this is the place where I find the peace. And I know I've got all kinds of, if I start to think of not only situations in the world, but in my own extended family and in my family, there's lots that could drop me into the hole. But I go back to Jesus. What do you want me to understand about this? And it's breaking my heart. And I can think specifically right now of 5 of those things. 5 of them that are really, really difficult things. We can talk about global things, and it's a great conversation. I love this conversation that we just listened to. I thought it was courageous, and I thought it was all the good things. And it's important. But then it's like, Jesus, so I heard this conversation. What do you want me to understand about this? Okay, is it, I've got an inability to hear about this, you know, the way Brandy was talking. Is there something that is blocking? Is there something that I don't get? Is there something that you want me to do about this? Right here, right now. But it's staying in the present tense, you know? So we all live in the real world, and the real world is the world that we're in. It's like moment by moment by moment. What you were saying, trust. This is all about trust. This is about trust. And out of that trust, then we express love in response to that which is actually in front of us, because that's the only real world there is. I hope that makes some sense. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. We are going to close with some music from John. We're going to bring John back up. And
Dude, I go to bed in like 6 minutes. I don't know.
well, you got to do 2 songs. And one of the songs I asked John to play is a song called "Fly Away to Hell," and I know I actually had to read the lyrics because you say the chorus really fast. And so if you could tell us just a little bit about this song and tell us the chorus before you sing it, because I think it's some of the most beautiful words in regards to this topic. So.
I mean, you stand here with me. It's not so awkward, is it?
Yeah, I can do that.
You don't actually have to do that because I realize.
You're good. Oh, okay. All right. I'm here to serve.
Yeah, Fly Away to Hell. I mean, look, it's already been talked about tonight, but there's a lot of blood on the hands of religious people. No, I don't think any of us would ignore that or deny it. And I think that, LGBTQ plus specifically being alienated and driven to suicide is probably one of the most heartbreaking and darkest things I can ponder upon. And so I was thinking about it, and I have friends, family, who have struggled with this, and so I just wrote it thinking about them. And so I guess when you first heard it, I dedicated it to anybody who'd gone through conversion therapy. But here's the deal. So I've struggled with depression my entire life, and so the thing that helps me stay grounded when I'm struggling is small beauties, small moments of beauty, especially in the natural world. And so I sing. You asked me to say the lyrics. It's hard for me to speak them and not say. It's please don't forget the way the sun hits the lake and dances back and forth, or the way a sparrow flies, or the way a rabbit runs away and stays another day. So I was just listing 3 little simple things that I think are really beautiful as a way to find hope, I guess. So anyways, I will sing this song now. I don't sing it anymore, and so I'm going to immerse myself in it in this moment. So I also want to say thank you for the conversation you had. It was really beautiful and courageous, and so thank you. You're different enough to feel unknown. fly away to hell. You just wanna fly away to hell. Sometimes you just wanna fly away to hell. Just wanna fly away to hell. But please don't forget the way the sun hits the lake and dances back and forth. Or the way a sparrow flies, or the way a rabbit runs away and stays another day. They say you don't belong here anymore. They quote that book, they close that door. And sometimes you just wanna fly away to hell. Just wanna fly away to hell. Sometimes you just wanna fly away to hell. Just wanna fly away to hell. But please don't forget the way the sun hits the lake and dances back and forth. Or the way a sparrow flies, or the way a rabbit runs away and stays. Don't forget the way the sun hits the lake and dances back and forth. Or the way a sparrow flies, or the way a rabbit runs away and stays another day. Sometimes you just wanna fly away to hell. Sometimes you just wanna fly away. Thank you very much. It's kind of a heavy song. I guess it's hopeful, but it's kind of heavy. And the other song requested is a song called All Shall Be Well, which is not heavy at all. And when people ask me what I think about a lot of this stuff, especially friends of mine who are not believers in Christ like I am, and we dig into it, the older I've gotten, I do have a sense, it's settled deep within me that I just think it's gonna be all right. And I know that sounds a kind of, and I mean on a cosmic sense. I just have this sense, like, I genuinely think it's gonna be okay. So that's why I wrote this song. I didn't write the quote that is the chorus, and I'll let you guys figure out, if you don't know it, who wrote it, so. Thanks for listening. Thank you for the sun, thank you for the moon, thank you for the stars at night and the darkness too. Bless you for your peace, bless you for your grace, bless you for your perfect love and your perfect ways. And all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things things shall be well. Use me as you will, remove my selfish pride. Create in me a servant's heart to bless your holy bride. When my work is done and the seeds are sown, please receive my spirit, Lord, and welcome me home. And all shall be well, all shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. And all shall be well, all shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. Thank you, guys. All right.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Brandy. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Riversgate and guests, for showing up for something like this, something crazy like this. It's beautiful and it's hard and it's work worth doing together. So thank you. And we'll have normal church tomorrow, but Brandy and Janelle are going to be preaching, which is going to be wonderful. John is going to do a couple special songs, and then we will have the lunch after church, and then the concert tomorrow night up at Hillsdale Community Church. I sent John pictures of this sanctuary and that sanctuary and asked him which one he wanted to play in, and he said that one. So better acoustics, it's going to be great. 7 o'clock. Yeah, don't feel like you have to rush out, but in about 15 minutes, we're going to just transition the sanctuary real quick. So if you're still here, you're going to be put to work. But bless you guys. We'll see you tomorrow, and thank you.